This is Peter Godfrey-Smith speaking to you from Australia. Please excuse the somewhat barren setting. I'm in a motel room up north of Sydney a couple of hours during a dive trip. There may also be a thunderstorm in the middle of this talk, which will add to the audio. I'm glad to be part of this event. A word about the title. The talk is about the role of gradual change within Darwinism, Darwinian explanation, and in particular, an example of a challenge that gradualism poses. So I'm not talking about a challenge to gradualism in Darwinism, but a challenge coming from it, and some ways in which a kind of gradualist constraint within evolutionary theory might tell you something unexpected about a trait itself. So that's where we're going, but I'll get there by a longer road. Darwin came out in The Origin of Species in 1859 with a package of ideas where two elements are often seen as most basic. Firstly, the idea that life forms a tree, that the idea that the tree of life idea can be given a literal genealogical interpretation, where there's a pattern of common ancestry, a network of ancestor-descendant relationships connecting all, or at least a great many, as Darwin saw it, of living things on Earth. And secondly, a theory he gave of how change works on particular branches of the tree, a theory in terms of undirected variation and natural selection operating in populations. Those ideas were included with a bunch of others. For example, I think that Ernst Mayr was right to talk about population thinking as an important part of the Darwinian package. And another one was the idea of the importance of gradual change, gradualism, as it's sometimes called, where here Darwin was influenced a lot by Charles Lyell's work in geology. Now, in the reception of Darwinism, a natural thing to do was to look at the package and to evaluate and criticize parts of the package, to ask, for example, whether you could have a tree of life without evolution by natural selection, and so on. And in those reassessments or assessments of Darwinism, for many people, the gradualist commitment in Darwin was seen as inessential and quite possibly wrong. And there were various degrees of dissent from this. So T.H. Huxley himself, Darwin's great ally, was not particularly enthusiastic about that gradualist side of Darwin's thinking. And at some stage, I don't know how early this came in, there was an imputation that the gradualist side of Darwin's view fits with a kind of progressive reformist English social and political mindset. Now, I don't know when that really began. I mean, certainly I think it was around in the next generation at the very end of the 19th century. I don't know tons about the history. Will Provine's old book, The Origins of Theoretical Population Genetics, is very good on this topic. The book is quite a bit broader than the very dry title makes it sound. Anyway, so Darwinism was seen as, gradualism within Darwinism was seen as very dispensable and very English. Now, there was eventually some pushback against that, and something that I think of as an important argument against that view was given eventually by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, 1986. This was a popular book written for a broad audience, but it has a theoretical heart to it, as Dawkins's books all tend to. And part of that was his insistence on gradualism understood in a certain way as essential to the Darwinian project. So he was criticizing Stephen Jay Gould and others writing around that time, around the 1970s, people interested in reviving mild saltationist ideas. And Dawkins wanted to argue that a form of gradualism really is essential and can't be dispensed with without undermining a whole lot of the Darwinian story. So it's not that it can't be wrong, but if it's wrong, it's a very big deal. And gradualism is not something you can just add and subtract without many further consequences from a Darwinian picture. Now, the sense of gradualism that Dawkins is talking about here is a very specific sense. And he talks in the book about senses he thinks of as inessential. For example, he doesn't think that the gradualist has to claim that everything in evolution happens at a constant rate. That would be absurdly strong and is not necessary. What is necessary is the idea of the incremental building of complex, novel, adaptive features. You have to build towards them in an evolutionary process in steps through a series of intermediates. And part of the heart of Darwinism, as Dawkins sees it, is an account of how a particular kind of step-by-step change has features that no other process has, and can give rise to various special outcomes. Now, I'm basically with Dawkins on this point, in a sense that I agree with those particular ideas. And so I'll talk about some of the details of the argument here. And the ideas Dawkins is promoting about gradual change here are linked to some debates about what's sometimes called the creative side of selection, or the creative role of selection within evolutionary processes. Okay, I'm going to share the screen from time to time in this talk to show you just a couple of slides. Okay, so let's start there. Okay, a bit more background here. Helpful thinking about the importance of gradualism within Darwinism. The discussion of gradualism, gradual change, is connected to a long-standing debate about the role of selection, natural selection, in giving rise to novelty, in giving rise to novel traits. So there's been a tradition of people arguing that selection has to be seen as a negative factor in evolution. And a good example of this was Hugo de Vries, who was important in the history of genetics. So de Vries said, as many other people have said, that natural selection is only a sieve and not a force of nature or a sort of cause of improvement, a producer of novel things. Once you've got some things around, selection can eliminate the unfit, de Vries says, and that's its role. It can't give rise to the things that are being selected. It doesn't have a creative or a productive role. Okay, to assess this, I'm going to introduce a little bit of terminology here. I'll distinguish what I call origin explanations and distribution explanations. When we give a distribution explanation of some feature of a population, we assume the existence of some things in the population. I'll just make myself a bit bigger. We assume the existence of a set of variants in the population, and we explain why they are distributed in the way they are, or how the distribution has changed. So, for example, why are these ones common and those ones rare? Answering that would be giving a distribution explanation. An origin explanation, in contrast, is directed on the fact that a population has come to contain individuals of a particular kind at all. Doesn't matter how many there are. The point in an origin explanation is just to tell you how there came to be some rather than none. And Dawkins, using my terminology, that's my terminology, but he wanted to understand the essential role of natural selection, surprising as it can seem, in origin explanations as well as distribution explanations. Now, I should give some credit here. So I've used my terminology here, but my terminology is derived, and some of these ideas are derived from some papers by Karen Neander, who wrote a series of papers in the 80s and 90s on this topic. One of the first to really press hard on these ideas in some places criticizing Elliot Sober, who'd written some papers defending a more negative view of the role of selection. That's a picture of Karen there on the right. Karen, unfortunately, died recently, a sad and untimely death. She was a philosopher who I liked and respected very much. While I was looking for a good photo of Karen in order to just make this acknowledgement in the talk, I came across this one, which also has in the photo Ken Taylor, another philosopher who I liked and admired very much, who also died recently. So this photo, which I take from David Chalmers' photo collection website, has two philosophers who both died too young, and both of whom were friends and people who I admire. Anyway, Karen wrote some papers about this, and I am developing these ideas further, I think. Okay, so putting it in my language again, almost everyone agrees that natural selection can figure in distribution explanations. And initially it can seem that selection cannot have a role in origin explanations, because selection can only sort things that already exist. Now, that wouldn't mean that evolutionary biology as a whole can't give origin explanations. They would be given in terms of what we now call mutation, along with the recombination of characteristics through sex. De Vries, incidentally, was the person who introduced this modern sense of the term mutation. So you might think that selection is a distribution explainer, while mutation is the origin explainer in evolution. And I, in contrast, also Dawkins, also Neander, think that this is not right. This is not the right way to divide things up, and selection is essential to many origin explanations in a way that gives it a creative role in the evolutionary process. Selection, on this view, is not an immediate or approximate cause of a new variant. The most important immediate sources of new variations or new variants, again, are mutation and recombination. But natural selection can reshape a population in a way that makes a given variant more likely to be produced by the immediate sources of variation than it would otherwise be. It does this because selection changes the background in which mutation and recombination operate. And in doing that, it changes what those factors can produce. So suppose we're explaining the evolution of the human eye. Now, building the genetic basis of the eye involved bringing together many genes. So consider a collection of genetic material, genes, which we'll call X, that has everything needed as far as genes go to make an eye, except for one mutation. So this background, or this configuration X, is such that if a particular new mutation arises in that background, it will complete the evolution of the eye. Now, initially, X must be rare in the population. It was the product of a mutational event that produced X from some other precursor, W. Selection can then make the appearance of the eye more likely by making the special background X more common. This increases the number of independent experiments, using the term metaphorically, where a single mutation can give rise to the eye. So if X remains rare in a population, then additional mutations are much less likely to produce the eye, because then the right mutation has to occur in exactly the right place in a lineage where X happens to be present. So selection makes the eye accessible to mutation in a way it would not otherwise be. So that's the story about the creative role of evolution. And it relies on the existence of several steps. And that was just told in terms of one little piece of a long chain, but there have to be many steps where some intermediate arises, initially very rare. It increases in numbers, where it's absolute numbers that matter, though absolute and relative are usually tied together by the struggle for life. And the increase provides many platforms for the arising of the next step. So in that sense, gradualism does matter. Now, this is a fairly low key, or in a way weak sense of gradualism. It's just essentially one that involves the role of intermediate stages along the road to the evolution of something important. Okay, what I want to do in the second half of this talk is talk about a case, a debate where this sort of thing matters, where it makes the difference. And this is going to be a quick sketch of something I've been working on for a couple of years now, and probably the thing I'm most concerned with at the moment in philosophy. And that is the evolution of subjective experience, or consciousness in a very broad sense of that word, consciousness, where in this sense, you're conscious, to use Nagel's phrase, if there's something it feels like, something it's like, something it feels like to be you. So this is the felt aspect of our lives, of our engagement with the world. It's the fact that we have felt experience rather than just engaging sort of with the world as material bodies. Okay, if you're a materialist about subjective experience, then this feature of us, if this thing has a material basis, then it has to have evolved by Darwinian processes, and that is informative, that has consequences. Now, it doesn't always get that much discussion in philosophy of mind. There've always been some people, such as Nick Humphrey and Dan Dennett and others, who've looked closely at the evolutionary stories that might apply here. But within philosophy of mind at the moment, there are ways of talking about the situation that cause problems on the evolutionary side. And in particular, there are fairly frequent denials that there can be what we might call a graded presence of subjective experience, that you could have cases where it's neither straightforwardly present nor straightforwardly absent. People deny that, but in a gradualist evolutionary story about subjective experience, there will very likely be such things somewhere, cases where consciousness in this broad sense is neither straightforwardly present nor straightforwardly absent. And we can think about this in two ways. We can look back first into the past and think about our ancestors and the fact that somewhere in the lines of descent leading from us into simpler and earlier animals and then into non-animal life, there must have been a transition between a situation where subjective experience was absent to one in which it's present, and in a gradualist scenario, then there'll be in-between cases. And similarly, not inevitably, but likely, if we look sideways across the top of the slide here, where I have various animal groups, this is a sort of a very simplified representation of the animal part of the tree of life, with common ancestry represented with distance down the screen to the nearest branching point. If you look at animals such as arthropods, crabs, insects, mollusks such as snails and octopuses, flatworms, and so on, it's likely also that in these, who are not our ancestors but our cousins, there will be there'll be situations in some cases where subjective experience is not straightforwardly present and not straightforwardly absent. Now, this might be denied. You might think that some very small physical change within an evolutionary sequence can sort of turn the lights on or turn them faintly on. I think some versions of that view are covertly dualist, but not all of them. And I don't discount it entirely, but from a Darwinian point of view, it is likely that looking into the past, very likely looking into the past, and also somewhat likely looking across the top, that there'll be cases of graded presence. Now, given that, it's interesting that this is quite often now being, fairly often at least, being denied in philosophy. So there's two quotes from Simon and Carruthers, who two people who find it extremely implausible or hard to conceive of a situation where consciousness in this broad sense could be something that has genuinely grey area, indeterminate cases. I won't read out quotes from them. A particular, oh, here's another one, right? This is from a more of a cognitive science discussion by Tim Bain and some co-authors, where they say the notion of degrees of consciousness is of dubious coherence. Dubious coherence. One that I'll put a bit more, I'll take a bit more time over, is from a very recent book, just came out by Michael Tighe, in which considerations of this kind take Tighe into a place that really is extremely radical. Tighe thinks that consciousness itself includes a representational part which can evolve gradually and come in degrees, and a part that can't, a part that has to be either sharply present or absent. This part he calls consciousness star. So consciousness in the ordinary sense involves consciousness star, which is a kind of raw felt aspect, plus another aspect, the representational side. And Tighe is so convinced that consciousness star, which again is this sort of more feeling tied part of the property, he's so convinced that that could not arise gradually, also accepts that if it's going to evolve at all, it's going to have gradual cases. Because he accepts those assumptions, he decides that it must instead be a fundamental feature of micro-reality and didn't evolve at all. So Tighe is led to a kind of panpsychism from the difficulty in conceiving of this sort of felt side consciousness star as something that, or from the difficulty of thinking of it in gradualist terms, he thinks in fact that you can't. So that really is a very radical thing to do, to conclude that panpsychism follows from this conflict between the sharpness of one aspect of consciousness and the gradual character of evolutionary change. Now, I think in contrast that, well, firstly, I think it's not so difficult to conceive of a graded or partially present kind of felt experience or consciousness. I think this thing does make sense when understood in degrees. Very, very imperfectly, a slow process of waking from sleep gives us a kind of model for that. But suppose there really is something in our concept of consciousness or subjective experience or felt consciousness that resists being understood in gradualist terms in this way. Suppose there's really something in the way we think that provides a kind of obstacle here. And that's part of what in particular is bothering Carruthers, Tighe also. Well, then here's a way things can go, which would be a response to that situation. You can have in evolution a gradualist story where something comes into being in stages through many intermediates, but where you don't have to think in terms of the graded presence of that feature X itself and battle with the fact that that presence might have to be a matter of degree. But instead, you explain how X, this important feature, comes to be by explaining how various other things get put together in steps. And when these other things, independently describable, have been put together in steps, when it's all done, then you wind up with a trait that looks very special. Then you wind up with something that looked like it was hard to evolve. Now, it might be like that with subjective experience. It might be that because of our peculiar point of view, perhaps because of contingencies of conceptual history, perhaps it really is hard to think about felt experience as something that comes into being, that can exist in kind of in a graded way. Suppose it is hard. Nonetheless, it could be brought into being by the gradual evolution of other stuff. And once those things have happened, then our language would attach straightforwardly to the final product in a situation where our language didn't have a kind of graded application to what was in place along the way. Now, would that be a sort of victory of sorts for the consciousness can't be gradual view? Could they say, yes, well, our concept, it retains this yes or no character? Not for me. I can see how a yes answer might be given, though. But what we would be describing is a situation where along the way through these stages, without jumps that bring into being something wholly new, you do have the gradual appearance of the thing that, when completed, we can describe using our familiar language of conscious experience. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to highlight. How do I think it will actually go, though? How do I think the evolutionary story might actually go? Well, that's not something I want to tackle in this talk. I'm going to give a quick sketch based on my most recent book, Metazoa, and on a paper that's a more focused discussion of this topic that just came out in Philosophical Topics. But roughly, I think that there are two things feeding into the evolution of what we think of as felt experience, what we encounter as felt experience. One is the evolution of subjectivity, of the having of a determinate point of view, of being the kind of system that encounters the world from a point of view, that acts from that point of view, has a way that things seem to that system. Specifically, I think that subjectivity, which is part of the problem here, is explained in terms of a link to agency. And agency has a straightforward evolutionary story, the evolution of agency. Agency is a central feature of animal life. Action is an animal specialty. So one part of a story is a story about, especially coming through from the early Cambrian through many stages to the present, you have the gradual evolution of definite subjectivity via its link to action. And the second part of the story is a story that involves some peculiarities of nervous systems. Part of the project of the book Metazoa in its latter parts is to get people to think a bit differently about what kind of thing a nervous system is. In particular about the role of large-scale dynamic properties of nervous systems, features that resist a description in terms of simple network properties, relay-like properties. And although the details here I have not yet worked out to my satisfaction, and there'll be more work to do, I think that the evolution of nervous systems, a gradual process, and the evolution of subjectivity, a feature of the way that animals of certain kinds encounter and deal with the world, that's the basis for an account of the origin of subjective experience. Now, in this talk, and to some extent in that work, I've been talking about gradualism, gradual change within a Darwinian setting as a kind of constraint on what we might say, a constraint on how we might think about consciousness and how it came to be. Something I'm starting to find in the work I'm doing at the moment is that it's more than a constraint. It starts to become a resource. It starts to become something that points towards the way a final story might look here. But I don't have time to do that in this talk. That will mostly be in the third book in that series, of which Metazoa is the second. So I'll stop there. I was glad to be part of this event. I hope the rest of the conference goes well, and goodbye from Australia.